Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming and joining this panel discussion today. I am Miho Kurosaki, your moderator today. I'm independent analyst on climate change and ESG. I spent nearly 15 years in ESG and climate change. As an analyst, I'm currently based in Singapore. So this is a great opportunity to come back and really looking forward to having a discussion today. And before we begin, I'd like to really thank FSA for inviting me to this wonderful conference. This panel discusses power sector transition. In my view, power sector transition to net zero is the number one priority, as clean power and clean grid is the fundamental to power sector decarbonization, but also for non-power sector decarbonization, such as transport, building, and industry. Today in this panel, I would like to get through three big questions, hopefully, if the time allows. First off, there are different pathways to net zero goals, but what are the credible pathways? So that's first one. Secondly, has the short-term goal, as discussed in the previous panel and also the discussion between Mark Carney and Hiro Mizuno already discussed, but what are the short-term goals? Has it changed because of the energy commodity price surge? And the third question I would like to pose to the panel is, what's the role of finance in the power sector transition? I know previous panel also discussed, but we would like to discuss that topic specific to the power sector. To do that, we have 5 distinguished panelists today, as you see in the slide. Unfortunately, Julia from Enel cannot make it today, but she sent us the video, so we would like to show her video later today. Kazuo Sakai, Corporate Vice President and Managing Executive Officer, Director, Chief Financial Officer, Finance and Accounting from JERA.
Thank you.
Jacob Tomei, research scientist, co-founder and executive director, 2Degree Investing Initiative.
Thank you. Research scientist also sounds great. Maybe I'll change my title.
Sorry, Jacob. Motoshi Tomita, research scientist, Sustainable System Research Laboratory and Socio-Economic Research Center from Central Research Institute of Electric Power Industry. And Matt Rinaldo, Deputy Director of Energy Transition Program, DNV. So let us first discuss different pathways. And I would like to actually go to Matt, so let us get opinions from you. What's the credible pathways for power sector? I know you ran sort of power sector modeling analysis for many years, so give us your thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much, Mio-san, and thank you for to the organizers here and for the invitation and the opportunity to speak at this symposium. So my name is Mats Rinaldo. I'm a research director for the Energy Transition Program at DNV, based in Oslo. And at DNV, many of our services are related to energy and the transport of energy. So for us, organization existing over 150 years, it's been very important for us to understand the energy transition and how it's going to unfold going forward. So with this in mind, we set up a research task to try to forecast the future of energy and the energy transition to 2050. And this is a job that the team that I work in have done now for 5 years. So each year we are producing a report trying to show how we think the energy transition will unfold. And this is not a scenario, but this is what we call our best estimate of the future, or what we think is the most likely going to happen. And indeed, it's a difficult task. Of course, we know that there are things that can happen. We did not anticipate the COVID pandemic, and indeed there are things in the future. But we think also that there are more futures that are more certain than others. So with this in mind, we have run a model simulation of 10 different regions and come to the conclusions that we unfortunately get not a future that we want. So in our forecast, we end up at about 2.3 degrees of global warming in the future, which is far away from the Paris Agreement ambition and the climate goals. So of course that leads to the next question, which last year we tried to answer. What is a credible pathway to net zero? So we used our energy systems model and then imposed a number of restrictions on this model to try to see if it was possible to reach a net zero pathway by 2050 and thus limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees. And of those highlights, we think that first and foremost, it is politically and technically feasible. So that was at least a great satisfaction that we think we will be able to reach 1.5, but indeed it is extremely challenging to do so. And the reason why it is challenging is that some regions are further advanced and some regions are not so economically developed. So in our pathway to net zero, we realize that in order to reach a net zero pathway, some regions must go further and faster than what they're currently aiming to do. And that means that, for instance, regions like North America and Europe, they have to reach net zero by 2042 in our version of a pathway to net zero. And IPCC, they have presented, of course, many different versions of 1.5 degree future. So there are many ways of getting there. But in our pathway to net zero, we utilize the GDP measure to try to set some sort of a standard of how fast a region should go to net zero. And in this future, of course, electrification, renewable energy, ammonia, hydrogen are all important aspects of reaching 1.5 degrees, but unfortunately, it's not enough. So CCS technology and direct air capture must be part of that solution in order to reach net zero.
Matt,
but
sorry to interrupt, but,
yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned new sort of type of technology is needed. And at the previous discussion, also IPCC reported, stated that new type of technology, example is carbon removal technology, is needed to achieve net zero. But when do you think these technologies will be needed? Because I think credibility is very important, and we don't have that technology yet to commercialize at the moment. What's your view on that?
The most critical aspect of this transition is time. So everything is dependent on how fast we manage to transition. And these technologies are not ready yet commercially available, and thus everything must be used of those technologies that we already have. So CCS technology is existing technology. Direct air capture technology is piloting and testing out, and that must be commercialized and scaled, which will take time. So it's only by the end of our forecast towards 2040, 2050, we see that these technologies can make a difference in removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And therefore, the importance of the acceleration of renewable energy deployment in order to buy us that time to get those technologies in place.
So we need to have certain type of low carbon technologies before those new type of technology comes into the market, which you said, which will be around 2040 to 2050. So we need to have a stable low carbon technologies to transition our power sector to net zero. Thank you, Matt. And I would like to move to Enel. Julia actually sent us video message. Please show her video.
Good morning, everyone. I am Giulia Genmardi. I'm responsible for sustainability planning, performance management, and human rights in Enel, a multinational utility company. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. So we are really conscious that we are living a profound process of technological and social transformation that is changing the whole society and the form in which it expresses itself. And we need an immediate and concrete commitment. In Enel, we are strongly convinced that electricity electricity is the most efficient, safe, and competitive form of energy, and thanks to renewable sources and storage, is the key to totally decarbonize our planet in line with the Paris Agreement. In 2021, we have announced the bringing forward of our net zero target from 2050 to 2040 for both direct and indirect emission. Specifically, with regard to power generation and the sale of electricity and natural gas to end customers, we have committed to zero emission without carbon removal or nature-based solution. A pathway that is based on the implementation of specific fundamental strategic stage. First of all, accelerate the process of decarbonization of generation activities, gradually replacing the thermoelectric portfolio with new renewable capacity, as well as making use of the hybridization of renewable with storage solution. Second one, by 2040, generate 100% of the electricity sold by the group from renewable sources, and by the same year to exit the gas retail business. Two important tools support and accelerate and boost this kind of energy transition. One is innovation, and the second one is circular economy. In 2021, we have launched in Italy a specific initiative to stimulate growth of the entire green hydrogen ecosystem. Together with startup and global player, we will validate innovative technologies capable of accelerating the full commercial maturity of all technology that enable the sustainable and competitive generation of green hydrogen. The second one, the circular economy, is a real important driver that we have, because adopting a circular approach means decoupling business and resource consumption by reducing the use of natural resources, avoiding waste, and maintaining the value of goods and material. We are also working in line with the recent international development on new metrics and new measurement concept to represent the creation of value and the quality of relation with different stakeholders in a more and more complete, comprehensive, and transparent way. We are also continuing to integrate sustainability objective into our financial instrument and management remuneration plan. In particular, in 2021, we have launched the Sustainability-Linked Financing Framework, a comprehensive document that extends the sustainability-linked approach to all financial debt instruments. Indicators, target, and principle have been defined that guide the development of sustainable finance through the group with ambition and transparency, linking the financial strategy to the sustainability targets. We are applying a systematic approach to sustainability across the entire value chain, but we are also strongly convinced that we have to promote a transition that is transparent, orderly, avoiding the creation of inequalities, based on active listening, openness, and creative solution, because only in this way we can ensure that society makes sustainable progress. So thank you very much again for your kind invitation. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. So Julia mentioned that, so their net zero goal, they set to be 2040, and then to be able to reach that goal, she mentioned renewable energy plus storage, and those will be replacing thermal generation assets. And she also mentioned circular economy, and to reduce the pattern of energy use in our daily life. So that's Enel's transition plan. I would like to actually from Mr. Sakariri about JERA's transition plan.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity, to giving us the opportunity to explain about the decarbonization strategy of JERA. Before explaining in detail about the strategy, I'd like to little mention about what JERA is, because many of the people who is attending this meeting is not familiar with the name of JERA. JERA is a unique company, largest power generation company in Japan, supplying approximately 30% of Japan's electricity. JERA owns the entire value chain of the power generation business, from fuel upstream business to fuel transportation, energy trading, and storage to power generation, and wholesaling. In addition, JERA has one of the largest LNG transaction volumes. JERA emits approximately 10% of Japan's total CO2 emissions. That is why we think that we are responsible for leading realization of decarbonization society. As Japan is an island country with no international grid connected, all of its power demand must be met by domestic power generation. It is necessary to promote decarbonization strategy while maintaining a stable electricity supply. Let me explain the decarbonization strategy. Please take a look at the slide on the screen. We have two strategic pillars for JERA's zero CO2 emission 2050. The first pillar is to shift from thermal power generation to zero emission thermal power generation. By promoting the use of greener fuels, CO2 emission is to be reduced during the power generation. The second pillar is to expand the development and use of renewable energy, such as offshore wind. As a first step toward achieving carbon neutrality by 2050, we have developed our roadmap to realize a decarbonized society in Japan. Our initiatives until 2030, there are three pillars. Number one, reduce CO2 emissions by shutting down all inefficient coal power plants. Number two, reduce CO2 emissions by practical application of co-firing of ammonia and hydrogen in thermal power plants. And number three, promote the development of renewable energy, focusing on offshore wind power and solar power generation projects. Through these efforts, JERA aims to reduce carbon emission intensity from thermal power plants by 20% based on long-term energy supply demand outlook for the fiscal 2030 as set by the Japanese government. And by fiscal 2035, we aim to reduce CO2 emissions from domestic operations by at least 60% compared to fiscal year 2013. Then, by 2050, we'll move on to the challenge of achieving zero CO2 emission from JERA's entire operations. Japan has geographical constraints on the development of renewables, which makes such energy sources expensive, and large-scale development of offshore wind power generation requires considerable time. For these reasons, thermal power generation is essential during the transition period. Thermal power will continue to play a significant role as a flexible generation even after sufficient supply of renewable energy becomes available. In this light, decarbonization of thermal power generation is required, which can be achieved with zero-emission thermal power generation. We have been promoting active use of hydrogen and ammonia to decarbonize thermal power generation. Hydrogen and ammonia are carbon-free substances which do not emit CO2 when burnt. CO2 emission can be reduced by co-firing hydrogen and ammonia in existing thermal power plants. JERA has launched demonstration tests of mixed combustion to reduce CO2 emissions from power generation and to achieve an ammonia co-firing rate of 20% at coal power plants. In order to achieve zero CO2 emission, we will pursue technological development and economic rationality while confirming consistency with the policy of Japanese government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sakari-san. I have a quick question actually in this slide. So if you look at the emission reduction goal, which says 60% reduction, which year do you base at? Is it based at 2020?
60% reduction? We will do that by 2035.
And which year are you comparing to? So
Compared with 2013.
13, I see. Thank you very much. So we hear three sort of different examples on the pathway to net zero. I would like to ask you, Jacob, what makes these plans credible? So, for example, audience mainly are investors or financial institutions. When they're analyzing or talking to portfolio companies, what are the sort of checklists do they need to have?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity as well to speak today. It's such a privilege being here. Really it is. And so it's great to see all of you here. I think when it comes to credibility, typically investors will look at about three different things. And some of them we've actually seen already in the presentations. The first is a meaningful short-term goal. It's like climbing up a mountain. If you're climbing up Mount Fuji and you say you will do it in 48 hours or 36 hours, and by hour 12 you're still sitting here in the Andas Hotel rooftop bar, it's not a very credible proposition. And so the same can be expected of the credible transition plans. I think the second component of credible transition plans is that they involve a meaningful detail about the nature of how to get there and the performance incentives that are there to make them happen, right? So is this a plan designed in a strategy department, or are there real performance incentives and mechanisms designed to create accountability in the day-to-day business planning of a company? And the third one is the nature of how does the transition plan design speak to the disruption in the system? And I often think here of a famous German poem about an apprentice who who tries to work with the master's tools and then is overwhelmed by the tools as they happen. And so I think sometimes companies and institutions are not unlike an apprentice here. We are often led to believe that the transition is kind of well anticipated because the first days of the transition are typically guided by strong policy design. So we can see the policy, we know what's happening, and we can see the technologies, and we are starting and everything feels safe. And then just like the apprentice in this story I told, the powers are unleashed. And how do you deal with that momentum when all of a sudden disruptive technologies outpace your plans, when new technologies come in, and when potentially it's no longer policy but market forces driving the transitions? And of course, in the power sector, two areas come to mind. One is the small size. So especially as a large utility, how do you deal with the rooftop solar and all these new distributed storage? And the other component is demand. And that's not a force that you control, but that is also disrupted significantly by forces. And just to give you one example, non-zero carbon technologies like AI in supply chains and shared economy and all those big terms, studies suggest they by themselves can account for the entire oil decarbonization needed in the next 20 years. And so how do you as a utility company not just design your zero carbon portfolio of products, but also your response to the disruption that may come from demand in both directions, of course, both high and low?
Thank you. I'm quite surprised that because I always talk about, use Mount Fuji example to talk about net zero and what the pathway is. So really, thank you. Really clear. Tomita-san, thank you for waiting. As you hear different sort of opinions from different people, what do you think makes the differences between the pathways and to net zero?
Yeah, thank you very much. So my name is Motoshi Tomita. I'm a research scientist from the Central Research Institute of Electric Power Industry, which is the primary technical development institution and funded by large Japanese power companies. So I'm an industry guy, but also our team is focused on climate policy, and the finance is obviously the most growing one. So answering to your question, thanks to the recent development of climate science, now we can refer to the more than 30 of the pathway, net zero pathway, particularly focused in Japan. So when I take a look at the variety of pathway focused in Japan, I think it actually depends on the assumption of total amount of energy demand and the proportion of electricity within the energy demand. But in some case, the renewable energy is not enough to compensate the total the energy demand in 2050. In this case, it is obvious that the nuclear and the zero-emission thermal power plant, which is, for example, hydrogen, ammonia with CCS, play a kind of supplementary role to nuclear, to supplement renewable power. And I would like to add another important role of the zero-emission thermal power plant is it also provide a flexibility and the capacity to the energy system, because when I take a look at the pathway, we always look at the amount of electricity generation, but the electricity also we need to simultaneously balance the consumption and the generation. So we need a backup within the system, and the thermal power is mostly contribute as a backup, as a capacity. Thank you.
Okay, we hear different sort of pathways, and I actually have a question from the audience online saying that any views on the different pathways, and we hear different technologies, right? So ammonia, hydrogen co-firing, hearing from Jera Sakairi-san, and also the previous panel mentioned about the hydrogen ammonia, green ammonia, or green hydrogen, or blue hydrogen, and so on. What makes sort of, when you see the pathways, including these type of technologies, what are the things you need to consider? So, for example, where these ammonia productions taking place, where this is coming from, is my sort of initial thoughts. What's your view, Jacob?
Sure. I think you already mentioned one of the first aspects, which is, of course, the resource itself. And even wind, as we know all too well, especially in Japan, is a resource that needs to be harnessed, and that doesn't exist everywhere, and sometimes more and sometimes less. So I think that's a crucial and first important aspect when you look at these pathways. The second one is how much do they rely on carbon offsets and net zero? So what is the ratio of viable technologies that are already commercially viable today, and if you will, magic, and I don't mean that in a too negative way, but some of these technologies at the moment are still in our imagination and not yet deployed. So that's, I think, the second critical aspect in these pathways. And the third is actually which is often overlooked, is what does the pathway say about population growth, GDP growth, all these other factors? And I mean, most of the sensitivity in many of the scenarios we see are not based on differences in beliefs about solar and wind, but are often based on these types of factors. Because if you think population is going to grow by 5%, you automatically are probably building in 5% growth of electricity as the baseline that you need to deal with. That's a different assumption than if you're dealing with declining population. It leads me back to my previous point, which is the solution and the outcome of this power story is most likely we need renewables and so on, but the way this will all be determined ultimately will probably be the demand and not the supply for the power sector. And that means both the demand for power and the electrification of transport and other factors, but also in the way we have energy efficiency, changing habits, changing demographics, and changing purchasing power inform our demand for electricity overall.
Thank you. Let me just quickly move on to the next sort of question. So given that energy price increases everywhere in the world, there are opinions about whether the emission increases this year or not. And I'd like to hear from Sakairi-san, Mr. Sakairi. We hear, on media, we hear some of the old fossil power generation, you rerun some of them. And do you expect to see the emission increase, or what's your sort of compromisation of the long-term plan and also short-term plan?
Well, I'd like to make sure that what your question is, but you were talking about the impact from surging the price and what is the impact for the...
Yes, energy security, okay. And you have to restart or rerun some of the old power plants, and we expect to see some of the emission increase in Japan or elsewhere, and that might affect your long-term plan or short-term plan if you have.
Well, we believe that the global trend toward decarbonization will remain unchanged. So although there is a temporary swing back due to surging fuel prices and the growing importance of energy security. JERA aims to establish a clean energy supply platform by promoting a low carbon thermal power, as well as zero CO2 emission thermal power in the future. So using hydrogen and ammonia to address the intermittency of power supply caused by the expansion of renewable energy. So, I don't think that the entire strategy itself has not been changed, even if this surging the price is going up, and operation of both low greenhouse gas thermal power and renewable energy will enable us to secure stable electricity supply and to achieve zero CO2 emission in the future. And LNG, I think, which emits a relatively low CO2 emission in all transitional periods. And we will, fully leverage our, diverse procurement sources to achieve a stable electricity supply in order to overcome the current crisis and move on to the next step.
Thank you.
In the medium to long term, we think we will build a supply chain for new thermal fuels, namely hydrogen and ammonia, and realize energy security. As a step to the goal, we announced an international competitive bid for more than 35 ammonia manufacturing companies around the world in February this year.
Thank you. Matt, do you see any changes in the short-term plan in Europe, where you're based?
Yeah, so indeed, I think that it's very fair to say that the war in Ukraine has greatly affected the energy transition in Europe as we see it. So taking into account the plans from European Commission and Europe to reduce the import of Russian natural gas and fast track that means that we see on the short-term basis a slight increase in emissions where then coal-fired power plants are being started up and energy security coming on the forefront and competing with climate focus. But I think in the long term, our sort of conclusion is that the fast track of renewable energy, as well as the import from natural gas and the enforced energy efficiency measures that will come as an outcome will actually sort of improve the energy transition and the climate aspect of this effect.
What do you think, Tomita-san? So
Yep.
you see sort of difference between the countries?
I think that we have already discussed that Japan is less dependent on Russian gas import, but still the gas is there's a high demand for the natural gas in the international market, even though the majority of the LNG is now purchased under the long-term contract, so the price impact of the fluctuation less, but it is obvious there will be delay in the transition in some cases, but also we will see the positive side of the Ukrainian crisis, where we will see the push for renewables, hopefully for the other low carbon technologies such as nuclear or development in the low carbon thermals. But anyway, the impact will charge additional cost entire system.
Thank you. So as you see, there are short-term needs to deploy a lot of capital to lower carbon technologies, but also we need to make sure also another capital allocation to the newer type of innovation to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So finance definitely plays a big role, a growing role as an enabler of decarbonization. And I would like to actually hear from Sakai-san, what's your expectation on finance?
Yes, we'd like to ask the financial sector, finance provider, to provide long-term financial support, since the energy transition will take time without suspending the energy supply. On the grounds that Japan is an island country with no international grid connection, as I mentioned, which presses us to meet all of its power demand with domestic power generation. Our plan is a smart transition that saves time and risks by utilizing existing technologies and resources, but it still takes time. So this is why we'd like us financial sector to understand this long-term roadmap. This month, we issued a transition bond to finance demonstration tests of hydrogen and ammonia co-firing. We will continue to issue transition finance to supply energy that reduces CO2 emissions, although it will take time.
Thank you. I would like to come back to Tomita-san, Mr. Tomita.
Yep.
As you see in the previous conversation, transition bonds and transition finance is a big topic in Japan. And do you have any advice for financial institutions in Japan or investors in Japan when they see transition bonds? What are the things they need to consider?
Yep. Thank you. So, as we have already discussed the transition to net zero, so we need to tackle with the various challenges, technological challenge and institutional challenge, opponent challenge to make some policy. Can make the policy changes, but in those ways we need to mobilize all effort to transition pathway to make that possible. In that way, particularly I have 2 points. The one is we'd like to see more collaboration with financial industry and the power sector. For example, not only to financing the specific technology, but also we like to see the more the collaboration with the finance sector to, for example, engaging policy to create a more enabling environment, or simply I'd like to see more communication between them. So to make clear what is the credible transition pathway, what is uncertainties, so when should we give up some options?
Thank you. What do you think, Jacob? Do you see transition bonds and transition finance a big topic in Europe or elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, so I already mentioned the Mount Fuji example. So obviously I have to now talk about sushi because otherwise I have to, make sure I cover all the classics. But I thought about this panel yesterday as I was having dinner because I realized that my entire life I've been eating sushi the wrong way and dipping the rice in the soy sauce and not the fish. And this is very embarrassing. I know. Horribly embarrassing. I can't believe I'm telling this story. And of course, why do you not dip the rice in the soy sauce? Because it's already pre-seasoned. And sometimes I think when we look at the financing needs, we go to where already the financing is at because it's easy. There is a pathway. There's already seasoning on it. Renewable power is the perfect example. We see almost oversubscribed. There is so much money in renewable power. This is not a problem anymore. And of course it isn't, and finance loves renewables because now we know it better, we have a track record, we've made the mistakes and so on. So really, as we think about transition bonds and new financing instruments, we have to think about the non-seasoned part of the industry, which is the new technologies. The example here with hydrogen, I think is a good one, is having the courage to go into these areas because that is where we still see the largest capital gap, in fact. And so I think as financial institutions look at those transition bonds, the first thing is to really look at, are we really pushing the company that we're financing to not just do the safe, but to also do, if we go back to the transition plans, the more complicated or the more long-term component to it. I think that's one important piece. And obviously to also look in the transition bonds, and that's obvious in the context of credibility, as whether we are doing and whether the company is doing enough, right? Is it really a transition that is meaningful and gets to net zero? So the European Parliament has now required, the proposal of the European Parliament, I should say, it's not passed, requires that green bond issuers have a credible net zero plan. The same requirement we expect to see as regulation comes forward and market practice comes forward for transition bonds. And so it's really important that beyond the transition financing, right, the two parts of this equation are, do the transition financing that's hard, not just that's easy, and do it to make sure that the company as a whole is transitioning and not just the specific piece. Because otherwise, I regret to inform you, you will be like me last night in the restaurant, incredibly embarrassed to have seasoned the wrong part of the sushi.
All righty, great. Mads, do you agree? And do you see any other examples on transition finance in Europe?
Yeah, so I think two aspects of transition finance that I like to highlight that is important to keep in mind. There's many pathways to net zero. All of them are very difficult to succeed in towards 2050 being at net zero. But in, for instance, our pathway, we see that coal-fired power plants have very limited utilization after the 2040s. So what I'm wondering is about how financing is taking account lifetimes that far is below the technical lifetime of these assets, other similar fossil fuel-based assets. All of a sudden, the cost of capital has to be increased. And of course, that also means that they are much more expensive. And I don't think we talk about that when we talk about transition finance enough. And that leads me to the second point is, if we have a number of these already existing coal-fired power plants or other fossil fuel assets that needs to shut down prematurely, how do we finance those? Who is paying for shutting down these assets before the end of their lifetime? That is also a discussion I haven't heard a lot about and like to see more of.
Do you want to add? Anybody wants to add, Jacob?
Yeah, sorry. I think this is such an important point, and actually one of the very interesting initiatives that are coming out of Europe around this now is the increasing focus on looking at virtual versus real emissions reduction in this context. So that's where investors start to not just disclose their footprint, or companies disclose their activities, but show, okay, which part of the reduction in the footprint is because we shut down the coal-fired power plant, or we shut down the asset, or we transformed the business, and which part is because we sold it to another party in the system. And so as we're, I think, looking at this, is especially, I think, targeted financial institutions, this is going to come, I think, increasingly in the next 1 to 2 years in Europe. We already see the largest Swedish one of the largest Swedish pension fund disclose in this way. And I think that will be the other part. Is the company achieving its transition by moving the deck chairs on the Titanic, or is it by actually saving the ship?
That's very interesting. Can you say which sort of pension fund in Europe?
Of course. So it's AP2.
Okay, Nordic one. Yeah. Makes sense. Okay, we are 3 minutes or 4 minutes only left. So my final sort of question to the panel: what is your advice to Japan's energy transition, especially for the power sector? Maybe we can start from you, Matt.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, Japan being an island nation is, of course, making the situation somewhat difficult. But as we already heard, energy security being very important. We also heard Tomita-san talk about nuclear. So from my point of view, 3 very possible pathways of reducing emissions: increasingly expand offshore wind. There's a lot of wind blowing. Evaluate existing nuclear power plants, perhaps keep them open if they meet security and safety concerns. And lastly, piloting on CCS technology and implementing it where and if those make sense. 3 points.
Tomita-san, do you agree? What's your advice to Japan's energy transition?
Yeah, but I'd like to go back to the first question. What is the credible transition pathway? From scientific perspective, there is no credible transition pathway. Instead, we have a credible interval along the transition pathway. There is many possibilities, but we need to narrow the wise of the credibility. And that's so we need to invest in the technological development, of course, but also we need to create a policy guideline. And as I said the last question, we need more collaboration to financial sector, government, power sector to collaborate with the make pathway better, more credible.
Okay, Jacob?
Don't season the rice, season the fish.
Great. Sakari-san, obviously you already talked about your plan, but what's the immediate 5-year plan for you?
Well, first, I'd like to really appreciate your comments and advice to the power sector in Japan first. And as I mentioned, the JERA is a company responsible for providing stable electricity to Japan. So this is the first thing. And at the same time, we'd like to achieve the carbon neutrality by 2050. But any efforts that we can do, we'll do. And also, we'd like to transform our technologies and what we have done in Japan to Asian countries. Asian countries, power demand is increasing. So what we can do for an Asian country is to what we did in Japan. So I'd like to assist the Asian countries to grow by transforming the technologies which are cultivated in Japan. So this approach is consistent with Japan's role, I think, and consistent with the Japanese government, policy. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we didn't discuss much today, but I think accountability and disclosure is very, very important, not just for power sector, but you really need to communicate. Power sector, companies and investors and financial institutions. So disclosure and accountability and reporting are also important. Okay, that's the end of the discussion. Thank you very much for joining the discussion today. And once again, thank you to the distinguished panelists. Thank you.